Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, the hardest steel in the world. Or not. So, what's the hardest steel in the world? Look, I'm not going to tell you one single answer, so maybe you'll say that the title of this video is clickbait, but I'd like to think that by the time you watch the video, you'll understand why I called this video what I did. See, people talk about hardness of steel as though it's the end-all and be-all of evaluating a knife, but it's just not. So, today we're going to talk about hardness from a metallurgical perspective, what it is and what it's not. And so, as a corollary to that, what it tells us about a knife. I think this will be useful to you whether you're a knife maker, a knife buyer, whether you're about to buy a knife, whether you're a collector. Everybody who's interested in knives should get a little something out of this. Now, before I get any further, most of my videos are very practical, this is how I do it kind of things, but not this one. This one's going to be all theory, so if that's not your thing, go ahead and bail now. So, people talk about the hardness of knife steel all the time as though harder steel is intrinsically better, and sometimes it is. But, they're throwing around Rockwell hardness numbers, which you'll often see written as HRC or just Rockwell C, like it tells you everything that you need to know about a particular piece of steel or about a knife. But does it? Let's find out. Okay, what makes a knife made out of steel better than a knife made out of Play-Doh? Obviously, steel's harder. So kind of the obvious thinking is, if hard is good, then harder must be better, right? Knife made of steel, knife made of Play-Doh. Damn, that's a crappy knife. If it's harder, it'll hold an edge better, it'll be tougher, it'll be stronger, harder to break, harder to bend. What it comes down to is, the harder a knife is, the more badass it is. Well, the truth is, no, hardness doesn't necessarily mean any of those things. So, definitions. When a metallurgist says hardness, what does he even mean? Well, hardness in metallurgy world, the dictionary definition is resistance to plastic deformation. Well, okay, what's that mean? See, the hardness of steel used for making knives and other similar tools is generally measured in units which are expressed in a single number called a Rockwell C-scale number, also sometimes called HRC, and you'll see sometimes written HRC 58 or Rockwell 61, whatever. So, where does this number come from? It comes from this. This gizmo right here is a Rockwell testing device. The way it works is that it takes a very shallow cone-shaped probe, this little sucker right here, which is tipped by a shallow cone-shaped diamond. And it just jams that diamond tip into the sample using a very specific amount of pressure. This creates a little tiny divot in the sample. The depth of that divot converts to a number which we can read on this little scale here. And that number is the Rockwell C-scale number. So, watch as we test a sample of unhardened S30V. This is basically just the way it comes in from the mill. We're going to place the sample on the table. There's a preload phase. Once we've got it preloaded, we set the dial so that it starts at exactly the same place every time. Now we give the probe its main load and it's going to squash that diamond down into the sample and sort of smush out this tiny little hole. The final Rockwell number shows up on the black number scale on the outside of the scale. So it comes out to about 23 or 24 on the Rockwell scale. So is that the only way of measuring hardness? Nope. There are a bunch of ways of testing hardness. There's a test known as Brinell hardness. In that test, there's a small ball-shaped tip instead of a cone. It's made from hardened steel rather than a diamond. There's Mohs hardness, there's Vickers, there's Shore, there's micro hardness, scratch resistance. So The same two samples won't always correlate exactly between different measures of hardness because each one of those measures is measuring some subtly different quality of the steel. Does that mean one test is more accurate or better? Not really. It just means, to paraphrase Bill Clinton, it depends on what the meaning of hardness is. Hard is what the test says it is. No more, no less. Want to see videos more often on this channel? Better videos? You can help. Consider partnering with the channel by clicking on the link to Patreon. Thanks. Now, back to work. So, what are we to make of this number? Well, before we go down that road, let's talk about what it doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us if we whack the crap out of this piece of steel whether it'll break or not. It might give us a clue, but it doesn't tell us absolutely. It doesn't tell us if it'll chip when we cut hard materials. It doesn't tell us if it'll bend and spring back when we yank on it. Or, conversely, it doesn't tell us if it'll bend and take a set when we yank on it. It doesn't even tell us whether this is a good steel for knife making. It just tells us that at this moment, if you jam a diamond with a conical face into it with 100 pounds of pressure behind it, it'll poke into the steel a certain predictable distance. That's what we've learned from this test. So that might sound like kind of a random little data point, maybe not that useful, but actually, of course, Rockwell is useful. That's why people refer to it all the time. But before we get into that, let's review how knives are actually made. Steel is capable of a wide range of hardnesses. So, typically, a knife is ground to shape in a relatively soft form, like this S30V steel that we just showed on the Rockwell tester. Then that steel is heated till it glows red, then cooled very rapidly. Now this cooling process, referred to as quenching, causes the steel to get harder, a lot harder. Once it's cooled down, it's then heated to a second temperature in a process called tempering, which softens it from that as quenched hardness. Why? Because without tempering, hardened steels are really brittle. So this whole process of hardening and then tempering is known as heat treating. So, if we know the Rockwell hardness of a particular piece of steel, we pretty much know if it's been heat treated or not. This S30V steel, we know it hasn't been. Most steel comes from the mill with a Rockwell hardness in the neighborhood of 30 or even below. Whereas when it's hardened, the hardness gets up to around 60. Again, give or take, it depends on the steel. After tempering, the hardness drops a few points. If you temper it at high enough temperatures, the hardness could drop a lot. So, this very same piece of steel that just rang in at Rockwell 23 can be hardened up to around 60 if we want it to. Actually, a little bit north of that. Alright, well, good to know, but you're saying totally doesn't help me, right? Okay, well, let's back up and look at what we want to know when we evaluate a knife. Will it hold an edge? Will it be easy to sharpen? Will it break easily if we whack it with something? Will it break easily if we bend it slowly? Will it chip when we are cutting hard things? Will it bend and take a set? Or conversely, will it bend and then spring back to its original position? These are all things that we might want to know, and these are qualities that we can test metallurgically. But unfortunately, the Rockwell C number doesn't give you a hard and fast answer to any of those questions. That said, it does give you some clues. So, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of metallurgy, but let's start here. Every piece of steel is composed of tiny grains, which you could imagine being smashed or welded together, though of course that's not really how they form. Each grain is a tiny little crystal, analogous to a grain of salt. In a carbon steel knife, those grains are composed simply of iron and carbon. But in most modern steels, you also have other elements like chromium, vanadium, tungsten. These elements combine with carbon to form yet more grains, known as carbides. So, a modern knife typically is composed of all these different materials, the iron and carbon itself, and then these carbides, and then they're all glommed together. And of course, all of them vary widely in their hardness. So, when the probe of the hardness tester smushes down into a piece of steel, it's pushing aside some really hard stuff and some stuff that's not quite so hard. So what do I mean? Well, let's go back to kindergarten and start with a little Play-Doh. We also have a stick with a cone-shaped face ground into it, just like on the Rockwell tester. So we'll jam that little stick down into the Play-Doh. Now, with a given amount of weight behind it, that stick will jam in there the exact same distance every time, because Play-Doh is all the same. Now, we can measure that distance and reduce it to some number. Let's call it the Rockwell Play-Doh number. But what if we put glass marbles into the Play-Doh? Try it again, and the stick just jams right in there pretty easily. So the Rockwell Play-Doh number is still pretty similar whether you have the marbles in or out, even though those marbles are just crazy hard. So if you tried to make a knife out of Play-Doh and marbles, it wouldn't cut very well. It wouldn't cut any better than the Play-Doh knife itself. But if you tried to grind through a chunk of your marbles and Play-Doh with a belt grinder, boy, it would seem a hell of a lot harder, right? Harder, in fact, than a bar of steel. So, which hardness is the real measure? Jamming that stick in there, or holding it against a grinder? Well, neither. They're just different things. In some respects it's hard, and in some respects it's not. We're back to that Bill Clinton thing again. What's the meaning of hard? So this is kind of what we're up against when we talk about the hardness of knife steel. Let's say you have straight carbon steel. All you have in there is iron and carbon. This is a piece of 1095 steel. It's got roughly 1% carbon and roughly 99% iron. There's a little smidge of manganese in there, but we're going to pretend it's not there. So Rockwell hardness is going to give you a pretty good idea of what you can expect from this steel in a number of ways. All things being equal, the harder it is, the harder it will be to sharpen, and the longer that edge is going to hold. But also, the more brittle that steel is going to be. Cool, this is all great stuff to know. So if we see Rockwell numbers for two different samples of 1095 or two different 1095 knives, we'll know that the one hardened to Rockwell 58 won't hold an edge as well as the one that's hardened to Rockwell 60. But the knife made from Rockwell 60 will be a little more susceptible to breaking and maybe to chipping along the edge. Okay, please, Walter, give me something I can use. All right, fair enough. General rule, blades in the mid-50s or even the low 50s on the Rockwell scale will need to be sharpened fairly frequently. Low to mid-range production blades, they tend to live in that kind of range. High 50s will generally take a little more sharpening effort, and they'll hold an edge longer. Low 60s, now that's really screaming hard, probably pretty good edge holding, probably a good bit of work to sharpen, but you're also starting to get into a range where a great many steels are going to get extremely brittle. So you don't want to get too fat and happy in that range. Some steels can live there and, take a beating, but most can't. Why not? Well, most modern steels have all these extra little grains in them. Just like the ball bearings that we talked about earlier, chromium carbides, and maybe in some cases vanadium or tungsten carbides, which are really crazy hard. So you have this combination of harder little carbides and softer steel in which those carbides are sort of embedded. So what about edge holding? If you add these harder carbides, these extra alloying elements, surely they get harder and surely they hold their edges better than soft steels. Well, yes, that is true to a degree, but once again, we have to drill a little deeper. The effect of alloying elements is quite complicated. So let's go back to our marbles analogy. There are chromium carbides in most modern knives. That's what makes them quote-unquote stainless. And sometimes you'll also see vanadium or tungsten carbides. Now these alloying elements come in the form of little grains that are distributed throughout the steel. So in a way, the steel is like that Play-Doh full of marbles that we talked about earlier, where the marbles are the carbides. So it might conceivably be fairly easy to push into And yet, when you go to sharpen it, your abrasives will be fighting against the chromium carbides, which are harder than the steel matrix that they're suspended in, or maybe even vanadium or tungsten carbides, which are harder still. Much like when I stuck that Play-Doh with the ball bearings in it against the belt grinder. So a carbon steel and a stainless steel might conceivably have more or less the same hardness, and yet the stainless will be more difficult to sharpen. And, by the same token, that same stainless steel might also hold that edge much longer. Those little carbide marbles, right? Stands to reason. Harder to sharpen, longer edge holding. Perfect. Done with discussion, right? Well, sadly no. So, just to make the picture even more confusing. Okay. I have to quit here. So let's forge on. I mean, surely hardness will at least tell us whether steel is likely to break easily or not, right? Well, actually, no. There's a metallurgical test called the Sharpie test, which tests how much force it takes to break a piece of steel when it's whacked with a giant and very sciencey kind of hammer. Now, the Sharpie expresses what we'd call toughness. In layman's terms, that's resistance to breaking. Now, not only is toughness of steel not directly correlated with hardness, it's actually inversely correlated, meaning that, the harder that steel gets, all things being equal, the more brittle, the more fragile it is, the more likely it is to break. Now, that's within certain limits, a lot of qualifications to that, but, basically, if you're boiling it down, the harder a steel is, the more likely it is to break when you whack it. So, if you're practical people, and most of you guys are, you're probably beating your head against the wall in frustration, thinking I'm never going to get to anything useful. So, all right, let me just try and boil this down to a few practical points. Point 1. Hardness is just one quality exhibited by steel. It gives you some useful information, including a general correlation to edge holding and some general sense about how brittle the steel might be. Point 2. Every steel is different. One steel might be fairly shock resistant at HRC 62, Rockwell 62, and another might just snap like glass. Point 3. So, the corollary of points 1 and 2 is that if you're really going to bother talking about Rockwell hardness, it helps to do a little homework beyond that point. So, let's say you're thinking about buying a knife. How much can you find out about the performance characteristics of that knife by understanding its Rockwell number? Good news is a fair amount, actually. So, check this out. If you Google, say, 440C steel technical data, here's what you come up with. This is what's known as a manufacturer's technical data sheet. Anybody who's interested in knives should read these things. You can find the results of tests performed by manufacturers on a particular grade of steel, sometimes even with comparisons of one steel to another with respect to a wide range of qualities. Not just hardness, but other important and useful qualities. Great tools both for knife makers and for consumers. Alright, so final point. What I'm getting at is that you have to look at the totality of a knife's qualities, how it's heat treated, what various other measures of the steel like shock resistance are, and things like edge geometry, ergonomics, things that play into how you're actually going to use the knife. So, Rockwell hardness is just one attribute of the knife. This one's 57 and that one's 59, so 59 must be better. Well, it just ain't so. Alright, so we finally circled around to my starting point for this video. The hardest steel in the world, well, what you want is the hardest steel that suits your needs. There are trade-offs with every type and condition of steel. So the challenge is not to find the hardest steel. That's actually something fairly easy that you could look up online. What you want is to find the sweet spot for your particular application. So, if this knife suits your needs, for all intents and purposes, it might as well be the hardest steel in the world. And if it doesn't, Rockwell 1 million, who cares? It's not the knife for you. Hey guys, if you found value in this video, I hope you'll consider partnering with the channel to help us bring more videos, better videos, more knives, more techniques, all that cool stuff. Click the link to Patreon to help this channel. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, bro, what are you waiting on? And check me out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all that good stuff. Also, if you're into Japanese swords, check out my website, waltersorrellsblades.com, where you'll see more of my work and where you'll find videos about the making of Japanese swords, along with mounting, fittings, polishing, hamones, all kinds of good stuff. Now, more videos.